Brooksville, Louisiana, nestled deep in the bayous, was a town where the scent of magnolias filled the air, and the sound of church bells echoed through the narrow, sun-dappled streets. It was a place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences and rarely locked their doors at night. With a population of just over 4,000, Brooksville was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's name and their business. For years, Deborah Jackson had been one of the town's most mysterious figures. At 55, she was an elegant woman with a reserved demeanor that kept most at a distance. Her late husband, Henry Jackson, had been a prominent businessman, owning several properties and businesses throughout Louisiana. His sudden and unexpected death 5 years prior had left Deborah a widow with a fortune large enough to rival the wealthiest families in the state. After Henry's passing, rumors began to swirl. Some whispered that his death hadn't been the accident it was claimed to be, that perhaps Deborah knew more than she let on. But no one dared to ask her, not in a town where she wielded so much influence. Life in Brooksville carried on quietly until one event changed everything: Deborah's unexpected marriage to a man more than half her age. Jamal Carter, at 23, was a newcomer to Brooksville. He had arrived in the small town just a year earlier, trying to escape a troubled past in New Orleans. Jamal was known for his charming personality and striking good looks. Tall, athletic, with a winning smile, he quickly became popular among the town's younger women. But to everyone's surprise, it wasn't one of Brooksville's eligible bachelorettes that captured Jamal's attention. It was the reclusive widow, Deborah Jackson. Their relationship was the talk of the town. Whispers filled the local diner, the church pews, and the corner store. What could a young man like Jamal possibly see in a woman old enough to be his mother? Some suggested he was after her fortune. Others thought maybe it was Deborah's loneliness that had drawn her to him. But regardless of the reason, their courtship moved swiftly. Just a few months after they met, Jamal proposed to Deborah, and she accepted. The wedding was a small but elaborate affair, held at St. Anne's Church, the most prominent in Brooksville. Nearly every resident attended, not out of support, but out of curiosity. Deborah wore a simple yet elegant gown, while Jamal appeared slightly out of place in his tailored suit, looking more like a boy playing dress-up than a groom ready for marriage. As they exchanged vows, many in the pews whispered to one another, predicting the marriage wouldn't last long. 2 days after the wedding, their predictions seemed to come true in the most horrific way. On the morning of August 14th, just 48 hours after the wedding, Brooksville was rocked by shocking news. Jamal Carter was dead. His body was discovered in the couple's sprawling estate, located on the outskirts of town, by the housekeeper who had arrived early that morning to prepare breakfast. The details were grim. Jamal had been strangled, his body showing clear signs of a violent struggle. His face bore a look of sheer terror, his hands bruised and cut, as though he had fought desperately to defend himself. The housekeeper's screams echoed through the grand halls of the Jackson estate, bringing neighbors rushing to the scene. By the time Sheriff Marcus Walker arrived at the Jackson estate, a crowd had already gathered outside the gates. The sheriff, a stoic man in his late 40s, had seen many things in his years on the force, but nothing like this. He stepped into the house, where everything seemed disturbingly normal. The dining table was set, the morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, and yet the air was thick with the weight of something sinister. In the master bedroom, where Jamal's body lay, the sight was unnerving. His lifeless form was sprawled across the bed, his neck showing the clear marks of strangulation. Bruises covered his arms and chest, indicating he had fought hard against his attacker. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass or overturned furniture to suggest a break-in. It was as if Jamal had been killed by someone he trusted, right in the heart of what should have been his safe haven. Deborah was found sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea. She claimed to have heard nothing, explaining that she had slept in a separate room that night as Jamal had gone to bed early, and she didn't want to disturb him. Her calmness struck Sheriff Walker as odd, too calm for someone who had just lost her husband in such a violent manner. As the sheriff questioned her, Deborah's answers were steady, almost rehearsed. She insisted she had no idea what had happened, that Jamal had been fine the night before. but Walker's instincts told him otherwise. Something didn't add up. How could she have slept through such a violent struggle? Why hadn't she heard her husband's desperate fight for his life? And more importantly, why wasn't she showing any real signs of grief? Walker's mind raced with possibilities. Was this a robbery gone wrong? A crime of passion? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface of Brooksville's genteel facade? As word of Jamal's death spread through the town, the gossip grew louder. Some pointed fingers at Deborah, claiming she had finally rid herself of another husband. Others speculated that Jamal had gotten involved with the wrong people in New Orleans, and that his past had finally caught up with him. But one thing was certain. Jamal's death was just the beginning of a dark mystery that would unravel the secrets of Brooksville, exposing hidden truths no one could have imagined. Sheriff Walker knew he had his work cut out for him. The quiet town of Brooksville had become a place of whispers, suspicion, and fear. And as he looked at the lifeless body of Jamal Carter, he vowed to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply buried it might be. The morning after Jamal Carter's death, the town of Brooksville was buzzing with speculation. From the local diner to the church, everyone had their theories. But for Sheriff Marcus Walker, there was no room for rumors. He had a murder to solve. As the investigation kicked off, Sheriff Walker and his small team of officers cordoned off the Jackson estate, carefully combing through every inch of the grand house. The room where Jamal had been found was eerily pristine, as if someone had gone to great lengths to clean up the scene. There were no obvious fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and the windows had been securely locked from the inside. The only disturbance was the bed, where Jamal's body had been discovered, and the faint marks of a struggle that indicated he had fought for his life. Walker's first priority was interviewing Deborah Jackson. He found her once again in the kitchen, sitting at the same table where she had been the day before. Her face, though composed, showed the faint signs of exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes, and the strain of someone holding back tears. But despite her outward appearance, there was something off. Her grief seemed hollow. "Mrs. Jackson, we need to go over some details again," Sheriff Walker said, pulling up a chair across from her. His tone was professional but probing, and Deborah nodded as if expecting the line of questioning. "I've told you everything I know," she replied quietly, her voice steady. "I went to bed late in the guest room. Jamal was tired, so he turned in early. I didn't hear anything, nothing at all." Sheriff Walker leaned back, studying her. "And you didn't find it strange that you didn't hear a struggle? Your husband's body shows clear signs of a fight." Deborah's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I'm a heavy sleeper, Sheriff. I wish I could say more, but I can't." It wasn't enough. Something was missing. Walker knew it. The pieces didn't fit together. He pressed on, asking about their relationship, their wedding, and whether Jamal had any enemies. Deborah answered everything calmly, explaining that their marriage had been sudden, but that they were in love. Her answers were too neat, too polished. Yet, there was no clear evidence pointing to her involvement. After finishing with Deborah, Walker turned his attention to Jamal's background. His officers dug into Jamal's past, piecing together the young man's life before he arrived in Brooksville. Born and raised in New Orleans, Jamal's early years had been rough. He had grown up in the projects, surrounded by hardship, and had spent his teenage years scraping by. When he turned 18, he'd made a move to better his life, taking on various jobs around the city before finding his way to Brooksville. But the move wasn't just a fresh start, it was an escape. Records showed that Jamal had run into financial troubles in New Orleans. He had accumulated significant debt, borrowing money from local lenders, many of whom weren't known for their leniency. Walker's gut told him that Jamal had fled New Orleans to leave behind more than just a tough upbringing. He had been running from danger, but Brooksville had seemed like a safe haven, a place where Jamal could start over. And marrying Deborah, with her wealth and stature, seemed like a surefire way to secure a better future. For a while, everything appeared to be going smoothly until it wasn't. As the sheriff's team dug deeper, they uncovered something unsettling. Jamal had been making frequent phone calls to a woman named Jasmine, a name that hadn't come up during their interviews with Deborah. Jasmine Turner, it turned out, was Jamal's ex-girlfriend from New Orleans. She was someone Jamal had been close to for years before his sudden departure. According to phone records, they had been in contact right up until his death. Curious, Sheriff Walker tracked down Jasmine, who was now living in Baton Rouge. When he called her, she seemed hesitant, but agreed to meet. 2 days later, Walker found himself sitting across from the young woman in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Jasmine, a striking woman in her mid-20s, was nervous, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "Look, I don't know why you're asking me about Jamal. I haven't seen him in months," Jasmine said quickly, sipping from her coffee. "We broke up when he left for Brooksville. I thought that was the end of it." "But you two stayed in contact," Walker pointed out, sliding a stack of phone records across the table. "You talked to him several times in the weeks leading up to his death." Jasmine's eyes flicked to the papers, her expression tightening. "He called me. I didn't call him." Walker raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Jasmine hesitated, biting her lip. "He was scared. He said something about getting in too deep with someone. I didn't ask too many questions, but I knew he was worried." "Did he mention Deborah?" Jasmine shook her head. "Not much, just that she was nice to him, treated him well. But I could tell something was off. He kept saying he needed to fix things, like he'd made a mistake. I didn't push him. Jamal didn't like to talk about his problems." Walker leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, reassuring tone. "Do you think he was in danger?" Jasmine met his gaze, her expression hardening. "Jamal always found his way into trouble, but this time I think he was in over his head." Leaving Baton Rouge with more questions than answers, Walker couldn't shake the feeling that Jamal's death was more complicated than it first seemed. Who had he crossed, and why had he stayed with Deborah despite his apparent misgivings? Back in Brooksville, Sheriff Walker gathered his team. "We need to find out if Jamal had any other contacts here in town. Someone who could have known more about his financial problems." As the days passed, Walker pieced together a troubling pattern: Jamal's debts, his hasty marriage to Deborah, and his continued contact with Jasmine painted a picture of a man trying to balance too many dangerous secrets. But the final piece of the puzzle still eluded him. The town, meanwhile, was turning against Deborah. Her calm composure at Jamal's funeral only fueled the rumors that she had something to do with his death. Neighbors began to whisper that maybe she had silenced him before he could leave her for someone younger. Others pointed to her wealth and hinted that maybe Jamal's death was no more than a calculated move on Deborah's part to avoid being used for her fortune. But for Sheriff Walker, none of the theories felt solid. Something deeper was at play, and the more he investigated, the more it seemed like Brooksville's most powerful widow had secrets of her own. The investigation was far from over, and as Walker stared out across the Jackson estate, he knew one thing for sure: Jamal's death was just the beginning. The town of Brooksville, with its genteel manners and quiet streets, was hiding something dark, and it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. Sheriff Marcus Walker had seen his fair share of strange cases during his time in Brooksville, but nothing quite like this. Jamal Carter's murder was beginning to look less like an isolated crime of passion and more like a web of secrets, lies, and deception. As his investigation pressed on, the picture became increasingly murky. The Jackson estate, once the envy of the town, had now become a place of fear and suspicion. Neighbors who had once admired Deborah Jackson from afar now whispered about her behind closed doors. It wasn't just her wealth or the mysterious death of her first husband that fueled their gossip. It was the chilling calm she exhibited in the aftermath of Jamal's murder. Her lack of visible grief unsettled everyone, including the sheriff. As Walker delved deeper into the lives of Jamal and Deborah, more unsettling details began to surface. The first break came when forensic analysts found faint traces of blood on the window frame in the guest room where Deborah claimed she had slept the night of the murder. It wasn't enough to indicate a struggle, but it was a small clue that something had happened, something that Deborah hadn't mentioned. But the most intriguing discovery came when Walker uncovered an old connection between Deborah and another man in town, a man by the name of Aaron Dupree. Dupree was a real estate developer, known for his cutthroat business tactics and rumored shady dealings in neighboring parishes. He had been a close associate of Henry Jackson, Deborah's late husband, before his mysterious drowning accident 5 years earlier. Some even speculated that Dupree had benefited financially from Henry's death, though nothing had ever been proven. Curiously, Walker found out that Dupree had been seen at the Jackson estate on several occasions in the months leading up to Jamal's murder. When questioned, Dupree claimed that he had only been there to discuss business. He had been interested in purchasing a few properties that Deborah still owned. But the sheriff wasn't convinced. The timing seemed too convenient. Why was Dupree suddenly interested in making deals with Deborah after years of silence following Henry's death? Walker decided to keep a close eye on Dupree, suspecting that he might know more than he was letting on. He also began digging into Dupree's financials, wondering if there was any connection between him and Jamal. What Walker discovered sent chills down his spine. Dupree had been secretly funneling money into several accounts linked to Jamal. The payments were small but regular, going back nearly 6 months. It was as if Dupree had been keeping Jamal on a tight leash, feeding him just enough to keep him under control, but not enough for him to escape. Armed with this information, Walker began to develop a new theory. What if Jamal's marriage to Deborah had been orchestrated by Dupree? Perhaps Jamal had been promised something, a way out of his financial troubles, in exchange for marrying Deborah. But if that was the case, why had it all gone so terribly wrong? One of Walker's officers, Deputy Sheila Thompson, who had been reviewing old case files, brought another disturbing piece of the puzzle to light. She had found a long-buried report from 5 years earlier, detailing the night of Henry Jackson's death. At the time, it had been ruled an accident. Henry had drowned during a boating trip on the river. But Sheila pointed out something odd. The report mentioned that Aaron Dupree had been the last person to see Henry alive. The two men had gone out on the boat together that evening, but Dupree claimed he had returned early, leaving Henry alone. There had been no witnesses to corroborate Dupree's story, and without evidence, the case had been closed. Now, with Jamal dead and Dupree's involvement once again looming over the investigation, Sheriff Walker began to wonder if Henry Jackson's death had been more than just an accident. Could Dupree have been involved in both deaths? The sheriff returned to question Deborah, who had grown more reclusive since Jamal's death. Her usually immaculate appearance was starting to fray, her hair disheveled, her eyes hollow. She looked older, more fragile than before, but her composure remained intact, as if she was determined to weather the storm. "Mrs. Jackson," Walker began, as they sat in her dimly lit living room, "I need to ask you again about the night Jamal died. You've told me you were asleep, but we found traces of blood in the guest room. I need you to be honest with me. Did anything happen that night?" Deborah's expression didn't change. She took a slow, deliberate breath before answering. "Sheriff, I've told you everything I know. I don't know how the blood got there. I didn't see or hear anything." Walker leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What about Aaron Dupree? We know he's been involved with you, financially. We found records of him making payments to Jamal. Why didn't you mention that before?" For the first time, Deborah faltered. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest, and her eyes flickered with uncertainty. Aaron and I have a complicated history," she admitted, her voice low. "After Henry died, Aaron helped me with the business. He's always been close, but I didn't know about any payments to Jamal. I swear." Walker's mind raced. Was Deborah telling the truth, or was she trying to protect Dupree? There was no clear answer, but one thing was certain. Aaron Dupree was involved in this somehow. As the investigation continued, Walker turned his attention to Jamal's financial troubles. He met with Jasmine Turner again, this time pressing her for more details about Jamal's last conversations with her. Jasmine seemed hesitant, but eventually revealed something she hadn't mentioned before. Jamal had been planning to leave Deborah. "He told me he couldn't do it anymore," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he felt trapped, that the money wasn't worth it." "Did he say why he felt trapped?" Walker asked. Jasmine shook her head. "No. He just said he was in too deep and that he needed to get out before it was too late." The sheriff left the meeting with a sinking feeling in his gut. If Jamal had been planning to leave, it explained why Dupree might have wanted him silenced. But it still didn't explain Deborah's role. Had she been a pawn in Dupree's game? Or was she more involved than she let on? Back at the station, Walker reviewed the evidence once more. The bloodstains in the guest room, The payments from Dupree to Jamal, and the inconsistencies in Deborah's story all pointed to a much darker truth. He wasn't just dealing with a simple murder. He was unraveling a conspiracy that reached far deeper than he had initially thought. The town of Brooksville, with its quiet streets and genteel charm, was hiding something rotten at its core. And as Sheriff Walker prepared to confront Dupree, he knew he was getting closer to uncovering the truth. But the question remained, how far was Dupree willing to go to keep his secrets buried? As Sheriff Marcus Walker closed in on Aaron Dupree, the tangled web surrounding Jamal Carter's murder grew even more sinister. Each new discovery only deepened the mystery. But beneath all the financial deals, power struggles, and whispered secrets, there was something else lurking, something personal. Aaron Dupree, with his polished exterior and smooth-talking demeanor, was not a man easily rattled. When Walker called him back in for questioning, Dupree arrived at the station with the same confident smile he always wore. But the sheriff knew there was more beneath the surface. He had already discovered Dupree's payments to Jamal, and now, with the suspicion surrounding Henry Jackson's death, Walker was prepared to push harder. "So, Mr. Dupree, let's talk about your relationship with Mrs. Jackson," Walker began as they sat in the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over Dupree's face. Dupree shrugged casually. "Business associates. We've known each other for years. Nothing more to it." Walker's gaze sharpened. "Business associates? Is that what you'd call it? We found records of you funneling money to Jamal Carter. That doesn't sound like a business transaction to me." For the first time, Dupree's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Whatever you think you've found, Sheriff, I can explain. Jamal was in a bad spot. He needed some help. I threw him a bone. Nothing illegal." Walker didn't buy it. He had seen this kind of deflection before. Men like Dupree thought they could talk their way out of anything. But Walker had something else up his sleeve. "Help?" Walker said, leaning back in his chair. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a lot more like control. You weren't just helping Jamal, you were keeping him on a leash. So let's drop the act, Dupree. What was your end game?" Dupree's expression hardened. "I don't know what you're getting at, but if you think I had anything to do with that kid's death, you're barking up the wrong tree." Walker's patience wore thin. "You were the last person to see Henry Jackson alive before his accident. Now Jamal is dead, and you've been making regular payments to him in secret. What exactly were you trying to cover up? Or should I say, who were you trying to control?" For a moment, Dupree said nothing, his jaw clenched tight. But his silence only confirmed what Walker had already suspected. Dupree was hiding something, and it wasn't just about money. Before Walker could press further, the door to the interrogation room swung open, and Deputy Sheila Thompson entered, her expression grim. She handed Walker a file, whispering, "You're going to want to see this." With a nod, Walker excused himself, leaving Dupree in the room. As he flipped open the file, his eyes widened at what he saw. Inside were surveillance photos, grainy but clear enough to reveal the figures, Jamal Carter and another woman. But it wasn't Deborah. It was Jasmine Turner, his ex-girlfriend from New Orleans. Walker felt the pieces of the puzzle start to click into place. Jamal had been seeing Jasmine in secret, even after marrying Deborah. But that wasn't all. The surveillance photos showed the two meeting late at night in secluded spots, away from prying eyes. It was clear their relationship hadn't ended when Jamal left New Orleans. In fact, it had intensified. Jasmine's involvement added a new layer to the investigation. Was she just a bystander, or did she have a role in Jamal's death? Walker had his doubts about her innocence. After all, she had admitted that Jamal was in trouble, but she had downplayed their relationship, making it seem as if they had barely spoken. The surveillance photos told a different story. Back in the interrogation room, Walker returned to face Dupree, but this time with a new angle. "Tell me about Jasmine Turner." Dupree's eyes flashed with surprise. "Who?" Walker tossed the photos onto the table, watching as Dupree's eyes widened in recognition. "Don't play dumb, Dupree. You know exactly who she is. Jamal was seeing her behind Deborah's back, and I'm willing to bet you knew all about it." Dupree swallowed hard, his confident facade cracking. I didn't know. Not about her." Walker didn't let up. But you knew about Jamal's other dealings. You were keeping tabs on him, weren't you? Making sure he stayed in line. What did you think would happen when he started pulling away from Deborah? Dupree's hands tightened into fists. Look, Jamal was in deep with some bad people in New Orleans. He came to me for help and I gave it to him. I thought if he settled down with Deborah, it would be enough to keep him safe. But he couldn't let go of his old life. That's what got him killed. Walker leaned in, his voice dropping to a near growl. Or maybe it's because you couldn't let him go. Maybe you were afraid that if he left Deborah, your little deal would fall apart. So you made sure he stayed right where you wanted him. Until he didn't. Dupree's face reddened, but he said nothing. Satisfied that Dupree was involved but not the mastermind, Walker left the interrogation, knowing the real culprit was still out there. But now, he had his sights set on Jasmine. The evidence pointed too strongly in her direction for her to be innocent. Walker wasted no time in heading back to Baton Rouge. When he arrived at Jasmine Turner's apartment, he found her pacing the floor, clearly agitated. The minute she opened the door and saw Walker standing there, her face went pale. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Jasmine's apartment was small and tidy, but there was an air of tension hanging over it, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I didn't do anything, Sheriff," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "I swear I didn't have anything to do with what happened to Jamal." Walker sat across from her, his eyes narrowing. "You lied to me, Jasmine. You told me you hadn't seen Jamal in months, but these photos tell a different story. You were seeing him right up until the day he died. So start talking. What was really going on between you two?" Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes as she struggled to compose herself. "We never really stopped seeing each other," she admitted. "Even after he married Deborah, we stayed in touch. He said he couldn't leave her yet. There were too many things he needed to sort out. But we were planning on being together." "And Deborah? Did she know?" Jasmine shook her head. "No. Jamal didn't want to hurt her. He thought he could find a way out without making it ugly." Walker sighed. "And Dupree? What was his involvement?" Jasmine hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Jamal told me Dupree was controlling everything. He said Aaron was dangerous, that he had something over Deborah, something about her first husband. Jamal was scared, Sheriff. He wanted out, but he didn't know how." As Walker listened, the pieces finally started to fall into place. Dupree had been using Jamal, manipulating him with promises of protection and financial support, all while keeping Deborah in the dark. But when Jamal tried to break free, things had spiraled out of control. And now, as Walker stared at Jasmine's tear-streaked face, he realized that Jamal wasn't the only one trapped in this deadly game. They all were: Deborah, Jasmine, even Dupree. But the biggest question still remained. Who had killed Jamal? There was only one way to find out, and that meant bringing the two women, Deborah and Jasmine, face to face. It was time to uncover the truth once and for all. The tension in Brooksville, Louisiana, was palpable as Sheriff Marcus Walker prepared for the final showdown. The truth about Jamal Carter's murder had been elusive, slipping through his fingers like water. But now, with all the players gathered, he was ready to confront the truth head-on. The small town, which had once thrived on secrets and whispers, was now on the verge of unraveling. Sheriff Walker had called both Deborah Jackson and Jasmine Turner to the station for a final confrontation. It was time to bring their tangled web of deceit into the light, once and for all. Sitting across from each other in the dimly lit room, the two women couldn't have been more different. Deborah, stoic and controlled, with her carefully composed face betraying little emotion, and Jasmine, fidgeting nervously, her eyes darting between the sheriff and Deborah. Walker stood between them, his arms crossed as he began. Jamal's death wasn't an accident. It wasn't a random act of violence, and it wasn't some coincidence tied to his past. He was killed because he was trying to escape a situation he couldn't control. Deborah's face tightened, but she remained silent. Jasmine, on the other hand, looked as if she might burst into tears at any moment. "You both knew what was happening," Walker continued, his voice hard. "You both played a part in his life, and you both had reasons to want him to stay. But only one of you had a reason to end it." The room fell into a tense silence as Walker's words hung in the air. "Mrs. Jackson," Walker said, turning to face Deborah directly. "You claimed you were asleep the night Jamal died, but we found blood in the guest room where you said you were. You knew more than you let on. You knew about Jamal's affair with Jasmine." Deborah's eyes flickered, but she remained silent. Walker pressed on. "I don't believe you were completely in the dark about what was going on," he said, his voice low and steady. "I think you knew Jamal was planning to leave you, and I think you were afraid of being abandoned again, afraid of what people would say, afraid of losing everything you had." Deborah's lips tightened into a thin line, but still she said nothing. "But," Walker continued, his gaze shifting to Jasmine, "I don't believe you killed him. You didn't have to. Someone else did it for you." Jasmine's eyes widened in shock. "I didn't—" "Not you, Jasmine," Walker interrupted. "Aaron Dupree." The name landed like a bomb in the room. Deborah's expression finally cracked, her eyes widening in surprise. Jasmine looked confused, her brow furrowing as she tried to process the accusation. "Aaron Dupree had the most to lose if Jamal left," Walker explained, his voice calm and measured. "He was the one controlling everything. Jamal, Deborah, the finances. He needed Jamal to stay with Deborah to keep his own plans in motion. When Jamal started pulling away, Dupree knew he had to act. He couldn't afford to let Jamal leave." "But why?" Jasmine asked, her voice trembling. "Why would he kill Jamal?" Walker took a deep breath. "Because Dupree was afraid that if Jamal left, everything he had built would collapse. Deborah's fortune, the control he had over her businesses, he had it all wrapped around his finger. But with Jamal gone, Deborah might have seen through him, might have found out what he was really doing behind her back." Deborah's face paled, her hands trembling slightly. "Aaron, he wouldn't—" Walker leaned forward, his eyes piercing into Deborah's. "You knew something was wrong, didn't you? You knew Dupree was hiding things from you. That's why you've been so calm this whole time, because deep down, you knew this wasn't just about Jamal's affair. It was about control, about power." Deborah finally spoke, her voice weak but steady. I didn't know he would kill Jamal. I didn't know." "But you suspected," Walker said softly, "and that's why you stayed quiet. Because if Dupree was willing to kill Jamal, what would he do to you if you exposed him?" Deborah's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to let herself break. Walker turned his attention back to Jasmine. "Jamal was trying to protect you. That's why he didn't tell you everything. He thought if he could get away from Dupree and from Deborah, he could start over. But Dupree didn't give him that chance." Jasmine shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He didn't deserve to die." "No, he didn't," Walker agreed. "And now it's time to make sure Dupree pays for what he did." With that, Walker stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Deborah and Jasmine were both led away, leaving Walker alone in the room for a moment. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the case finally settling on his shoulders. The next day, armed with the evidence he had gathered, Walker and his team moved quickly. Aaron Dupree was arrested on charges of conspiracy and murder, his smooth-talking facade shattered in the face of the overwhelming evidence. As Dupree was led away in handcuffs, the town of Brooksville breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the damage had been done. Jamal Carter was gone, a young life cut short by greed, manipulation, and betrayal. Deborah Jackson, once the queen of Brooksville, was now a shattered woman, left to pick up the pieces of her life after the man she had trusted had orchestrated the destruction of everything she held dear. For Jasmine Turner, the loss of Jamal was a wound that would never fully heal. She had loved him, despite his flaws, and now she had to live with the knowledge that his death had been a result of forces far beyond their control. As Sheriff Marcus Walker stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching as Dupree was driven away to face justice, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, but it was a hollow victory. The case was solved, but the lives it had destroyed would never truly recover. Brooksville, Louisiana would never be the same again.